Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and normally I release episodes immediately to the Place We Find Ourselves app, and episodes become free 4 weeks later. However, given the coronavirus crisis, I've decided to release this episode to everyone immediately. But please consider supporting the podcast financially. You can do that right from my website. Okay, let's dive in. My purpose today is to invite you into a new relationship with the book of Psalms during this time of immense social upheaval, fear, anxiety, dread. This is an emotional time. We are all having big feelings. And when we are having big feelings, the place we need to find ourselves is in the Psalms. When you don't know how to express what's going on inside of you, the place to turn is the Psalms. When the world has been turned upside down, the place that we as a community of Christians, the place that we will find ourselves is in the Psalms. So, what is your relationship to the book of Psalms? Do you like the Psalms? Do you tolerate them? Do you find the book of Psalms hard to understand and therefore not very helpful to your present day-to-day life? Today, I hope to open up the power of the book of Psalms for a moment such as this, a moment in which the coronavirus is profoundly influencing each of our hearts, minds, and bodies. And by the end of the episode, my invitation to you will be, what would it look like to begin writing your own Psalms and then praying the Psalms that you write? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin by asking this. What is the book of Psalms all about, and why is it in the Bible? Or a better question, what are the Psalms even doing? What's their function? Let me say at the outset that I am deeply indebted to Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann for this episode. I will quote him at times, but please know that this entire episode is built on the foundation of his work with the Psalms, which was immensely personal to him, to his own relationship with God, even though he was an academic and a scholar. No one has given me access to the Psalms like Walter Brueggemann. If you want to read his work directly, the place to start is a book called Praying the Psalms. Praying the Psalms. Okay, when you read the book of Psalms, you will see that most of the Psalms are the prayers of people who are at the desperate edge of their lives. The desperate edge. And many people today are feeling either at the desperate edge of their lives or like we are moving toward the desperate edge, that it's coming. Brueggemann puts it like this. He says the Psalms present human persons in situations of regression when they are most vulnerable and hurt, most sensitized to life, driven to the extremities of life and faith. The fallout from the coronavirus has made us feel more vulnerable and more sensitized. In other words, we are feeling big feelings. Many of us are feeling things every day that we don't normally feel this strongly or this frequently. And that's why the Psalms are so important right now. The Psalms are the prayers of people who are fully present to the rawness of their emotions and fully present to the diversity of their emotions. In this sense, the Psalms are a phenomenal gift of God to us, because it can be hard to know all of what's happening inside of you. And it can be even harder to bring to speech all of these emotions in all of their rawness and all of their complexity. Even if you can feel your feelings right now, it can be very hard to put words to those feelings and to express them adequately or fully. But if you open the book of Psalms, you will find that you are introduced to your feelings, introduced to the commotion inside your heart. Yes, introduced to your very own heart. Athanasius was a 4th century church father, and he said this about the Psalms. He said, in the book of Psalms, you learn about yourself. You find depicted in the Psalms all the movements of your soul, all its changes, all its ups and downs. That's Athanasius. In the book of Psalms, you learn about yourself. And he goes on to say, look, most of the Bible is about what other people said and did. But in the Psalms, It is as though it were one's own words that one read, and anyone who hears the words of the Psalms is moved at heart, as though the Psalms voiced for him or her his own deepest thoughts. That's Athanasius. And that's a great way of putting it. The evocative language of the Psalms has a way of voicing for us our own deepest thoughts, feelings, longings, desires. Now, here's the thing. Experiences of extremity, like what many of us are experiencing right now, experiences of extremity lead to big emotions, combined with difficulty naming and expressing those emotions. And when we can't name and express the big feelings inside, we can't integrate those feelings into our brains and bodies. Brueggemann puts it like this. He says human experience includes those dangerous and difficult times of disorientation when the sky does fall and the world does come to an end. The times of disorientation are times when persons are driven to the extremities of emotion, of integrating capacity, and of language. The worldwide crisis that we are all experiencing right now impairs integrative functioning in the brain. That's what trauma does. Trauma overwhelms the brain's ability to integrate, that is, connect our emotions about an experience with our thoughts and our bodily sensations. When a worldwide crisis hits, when the sky does fall, we find ourselves in what the psalmists call the pit. The pit is the metaphor that the psalmists so often use. Psalm 69 says, "Do not let the floodwaters engulf me, or the depths swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me." COVID-19 has thrown many pockets of the world into the pit. And because of technology, even if your particular locale is not yet in the pit, even if you aren't personally feeling the depth of the pit, even if your healthcare system is not overwhelmed, you have an awareness that there is disaster happening nearby. And you don't know what the future holds, and you don't know what's coming to you. That felt sense in your body is what the psalmists are getting at when they say, "I am in the pit." In the book of Psalms, the pit refers to a state of being cut off from friends, family, and the broader community, and being powerless to get out of that horrible situation. Does that sound familiar? That is precisely the place we find ourselves right now. Many of us feel cut off from loved ones and friends and community because of social distancing and or illness, and there's nothing we can do to get out of this situation except wait. The pit, the metaphor of the pit, the language of the pit is about powerlessness, and it's about social isolation. Now, when we find ourselves in the pit, the invitation of the Psalms is to let the feelings inside come to expression in lament. Let the feelings inside come to expression in lament. We are not called to pull ourselves out of the pit. We are not called to climb out of the pit. We are called to identify the full range of our feelings and bring them to speech. More often than not, the need to lament comes about quite unexpectedly for the psalmist. Everything was normal. Everything was going just fine. And then suddenly, bam, something bad happens, and the psalmist finds himself in the pit of social isolation and powerlessness. This is exactly what has happened for many of us. For most people, coronavirus came out of nowhere. As Brueggemann puts it, Psalms of Lament are speeches of surprised dismay and disappointment, for the speaker never expected this to happen to him or her. The speaker never expected this to happen to him or her. The psalmist didn't expect the tragedy to strike. When things are going along just fine, we tend to not say much in prayer, at least not much that is said with urgency and poignancy. But the Psalms of Lament are, again, in Brueggemann's words, the Psalms of Lament are the shrill speeches of those who suddenly discover that they are trapped and the water is rising and the sun may not come up tomorrow. Lament is what we are called to do when we have been dislocated from the previous normal, when we are in a state of disorientation. As a country, as a world, we are disoriented right now because we are collectively in the pit. The old status quo, the old equilibrium is gone, and we are living in a state of disruption, disequilibrium, disorientation, dis-ease. This is precisely where the Psalms come in with such unflinching honesty and real-life relevance. The peculiar brilliance of the Psalms is that they speak about human experience in a raw and honest way. And this matters in a cultural moment in which most human speech is a cover-up. When nothing really bad is going on, we are expected to speak the language of what Brueggemann calls safe orientation and equilibrium. We are expected to pretend that everything is fine and good and nothing that bad is happening in our communities and in our world. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons why people who are marginalized, the poor, people of color, the excluded, the disabled, this is why these people tend to be much more familiar with lament than those of us in the dominant culture. Why? Because the language of lament tells the truth about their day-to-day experience of marginalization and oppression. Here's the point. The Psalms know that life is unfair and unjust. The Psalms know it. Many psalmists are prophets who are pleading with the dominant culture to wake up to the reality of injustice on Main Street. The Psalms know that oppression and injustice are real things, and that these real things affect the inside of the human body, namely our feelings. No cover-up is necessary. The raw language of the Psalms invites us to tell it like it is, especially to tell it like it is on the inside of our bodies and hearts. Which brings me to the main point of today's episode. What would it be like to begin praying the Psalms? I am not primarily inviting you to read the Psalms. I am inviting you to pray the Psalms. There is a big difference. It's the difference between maintaining a safe distance in your relationship with God and getting right up close to God, face to face, with your desperation, your plea, your complaint, your need. When you just read the Psalms, you can maintain a nice, safe distance from your raw feelings and from your desperate need for God. But when you begin to pray the words on the page, and especially when you begin to make them your own, suddenly things get far more intimate and real between you and God. It's important to understand that the Psalms have been designed to be appropriated by us, which is a fancy way of saying that God's purpose for the Psalms is for us to take them and make them our own, to tweak the language so that we are rewriting the Psalm for our particular present circumstance. When you read the Psalms, you will notice that even though there is significant detail, you often can't tell what discrete problem the psalmist is facing. It could be sickness or betrayal, false accusation, mockery. You often can't tell what the specific problem is. And that's the point. The psalmists leave so much open. They are basically begging you to make them your own. Brueggemann says it this way: the psalm provides a marvelous receptacle which we are free to fill with our particular experience. Let me say it again. The psalm provides a marvelous receptacle which we are free to fill with our particular experience. Have you ever taken one of the Psalms and used it as a receptacle to fill with your particular experience? Have you ever taken one of the Psalms and replaced certain words with words that describe your present circumstances, your feelings, your life? What is stopping you from making one of the Psalms your own today and bringing your earnest and unedited speech to God by praying a psalm that you modified to make your own? The Psalms are there to let us know that we need not censure or deny the depth of our own feelings. Instead, we are invited to bring our feelings to passionate and gritty speech and address our words to a God who is immensely personal to us. Okay, let's get down to specifics and talk about how to make the Psalms your own. How do you modify a psalm, or how do you write your own psalm? And then how do you pray the words you have just written? Brueggemann points out that there are several elements to psalmic speech, and that these elements are used in all sorts of configurations depending on the circumstances of the prayer. I'm going to run through a few of the elements, and then you put them together in whatever order you want to fit the circumstance that you find yourself in. The first element of psalmic prayer is intimate address. Intimate address. The psalmist often begins the prayer by naming God in a particularly intimate way, such as my God or my righteous God. In other words, the soon-to-be voiced complaint is not uttered to a stranger, but is spoken to a God with whom you have an ongoing relationship built on trust. The soon-to-be voiced complaint is not uttered to an empty sky or to a ceiling. It is spoken to someone deeply personal to you whom you believe is listening intently. So, the first element you might want to include in your psalm is intimate address. The second element is complaint. This is where you tell God just how troubled your life really is. You name with specificity what the trouble is this particular day. And feel free to overstate the trouble. The psalmists do it all the time. The goal is to get God's attention and call God to act. Let me say that again. The goal of speaking your complaint is to get God's attention and call God to act. Because we, like the psalmists, often experience God as absent, silent, or uncaring. As Brueggemann puts it, the goal of this part of your psalm is to recruit God into the trouble. I love that. To recruit God into the trouble that is facing you. And by the way, for those of you who are familiar with attachment, do you hear how deeply attachment is at play in your relationship with God? But that's another podcast episode. Okay. The purpose of stating your complaint, back to complaint, the purpose of stating your complaint, that is, telling God what is troubling you, is to get God's attention. It's a reach. You're reaching out your hand to God and saying, help, I'm drowning in these particular ways. The third element to include in your psalm is petition. This is the main event. You are bringing to God an unedited demand. Turn. Pay attention, rescue. Brueggemann says it like this. He says, look, the premise of so many of the Psalms is that God can rescue you if only God can be mobilized. The third element of petition, this third element, petition, is aimed at mobilizing God to move and rescue you. If you read the Psalms, you will notice that the psalmist often brings an insistent demand to God, and the psalmist does it without much show of deference. We label these demands as petition. What a lovely, nice word, petition. But it's a euphemism for the childlike demand of the psalmists. So, for example, in Psalm 25, the psalmist prays, "Turn to me and grant me grace, for alone and afflicted am I. The distress of my heart has grown great. From my straits bring me out." What's the psalmist saying? Turn to me, God. Bring me out of this mess. There is nothing polite or deferential here. This is an insistent plea, much like a child in need brings an urgent demand to a parent. So, what do you need God to do on your behalf? This third element of your psalm is where you put words to that need and you bring it unedited to your God. The Psalms demonstrate Israel's commitment to protest. Protest. Israel recognizes that the world in this particular moment is not right. Something is drastically wrong. And the psalmist's response is protest. They respond to the recognition that all is not right in the world by protesting. They bring their protest to God, the creator of the world, and the only one who can set things to rights again. Now look, as an important caveat, the Psalms were written before God had revealed the full extent of his goodness to us in Jesus. Therefore, the Psalms include many, many attempts to persuade God to act. I would not want anyone to fall into the trap of striving in prayer. Prayer is not about striving. It is not about persuading God to move his hand or twisting God's arm. That's not what I'm talking about here. This is not an episode on prayer, and so I can't flesh out the distinctions. But for now, the point I want to make is that there is a way to pray psalmically without feeling like you are trying to twist God's arm to rescue you. God's arm does not need to be twisted. It is already predisposed to rescue. We know that because of what God did on the cross through Jesus. God's arm is predisposed to rescue. What the Psalms show us is that when we dare to express our need to God, when we bring all of our hurt and urgent demand to God in prayer, something unexpected happens. Namely, God acts. God is mobilized into action, and God rescues the psalmist. And God will rescue you. Here's how Brueggemann puts it. This is very important. Brueggemann says that once the psalmist pours out their anger and pours out their protest, the pain moves to a positive resolution. It is not at all clear what happens that permits such a turn, but it is clear that such a turn belongs regularly to the pattern and genre of lament. The psalm is genuinely dialogical. It receives an answer that resolves the need of the speaker. Thus, continues Brueggemann, the psalm accomplishes something. And the speaker is, at the end of the psalm, in a very different place. Did you catch that? Brueggemann is saying, hey, we don't know what happens that prompts the psalmist to suddenly turn to praising and thanking God for rescue, but we know that the praying of the psalm resulted in God's act of rescuing the prayer. God intervened. Now, here's how Brueggemann articulates this nuance. He says the psalmist may not cause the intervention from God, but what these psalmists confess without a dissenting vote is that intervention will not happen without the prayer being prayed. How can that be, you ask? I don't know. I don't claim to understand God, but I do understand something of what the psalmist is doing because I've done it in my own life and I've experienced God's rescue. The praying of your own psalm accomplishes something. This is why when you read so many of the Psalms, the mood will drastically shift mid-psalm. In one verse, the psalmist is desperately complaining, and then in the next verse, the psalmist is praising or thanking God for rescue. And it's like, what happened? The praying of the psalm, the direct engagement with God, somehow brings about rescue for the psalmist. Do you believe that? Now look, we have no idea how much time elapsed between when the psalmist cried out for rescue and when the rescue actually came. We don't know how much time elapsed between Psalm 13, verse 3, where the psalmist cries out, "Look on me and answer, Lord my God," and verse 5, when the psalmist suddenly says, "But I trust in your unfailing love." We don't know how much time elapses between "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" and "But I trust in your unfailing love." Lots of time may have passed between the cry of the psalmist and the coming through of God. What we do know from the book of Psalms is that the praying of the psalm, that is direct engagement with your God, somehow brings about rescue for the psalmist. So here's the point. I want to invite you to begin writing your own psalms and praying your own psalms. In the next episode, I will go into detail about how to go about writing and praying your own psalms. But why wait 2 weeks? Take a stab at it this week. When you start putting the cries of your heart on paper in prayer to God, things suddenly get very real and very limbic with God. And that's a good thing, a very good thing. Thank you so much for listening. I will be back with more in 2 weeks.